Imagine this. The President of the United States, with a whole armada of helicopters, flies into Switzerland. He stands before the world's most powerful financial and political elites and tries to buy an entire country. But this wasn't just some crazy real estate deal. No, this was a high-stakes geopolitical play, a gambit that threatened to tear apart alliances and maybe even kick off a global trade war. This is the story of the Greenland Gambit.
So this was the opening pitch. The dealmaker-in-chief, trying to frame the takeover of Greenland as just a small thing, for world peace. But just listen to those words. Calling a sovereign nation's territory ice-cold and poorly located, this was not your standard diplomacy. This was the first shot fired in what turned out to be a really bizarre international showdown.
So what was this really all about? Was it a serious strategic move to get a leg up on global rivals? Or maybe some kind of weird high-pressure negotiating tactic? Or was it just a massive, massive misunderstanding? Answering that question, well, it pulls back the curtain on a fascinating and pretty dangerous clash between diplomacy, business, and raw, unfiltered power.
And you really can't overstate the importance of the setting here. We're talking about Davos. This is where the global elite get together to basically map out the future of the world economy. And it was right there, on that massive stage, that this pitch was made, and where it pretty much immediately started to fall apart under the weight of its own mistakes. And the level of confusion was, well, it was staggering. This wasn't just one little slip of the tongue. Greenland was called Iceland 4 different times. And then came this claim that the US gave Greenland back after the war, something that, fact check, literally never happened. These weren't just simple gaffes. They were huge cracks in the foundation of the whole proposal before it even had a chance to get going.
So, with the official pitch basically full of holes, we've got to dig a little deeper. Was this even a real offer to begin with? Or was it something else? A lot of people there concluded it was a business tactic you'd see in a corporate raid, a hostile takeover attempt, playing out on the world stage.
And right here, this is the core of the strategy. You offer an olive branch, but you show the iron fist. First, you get the reassurance, I don't want to use force. But right after that comes the reminder of that power, calling the US, frankly, unstoppable. It's a classic move, right? Presenting a choice that isn't really a choice at all. And that last line, we will remember, that's not a promise, that is a threat, plain and simple.
This quote from a diplomat who was actually in the room, it just captures the shockwave perfectly. People felt like this wasn't diplomacy, it was something else entirely. It felt less like a negotiation between allies and way more like a shakedown.
Now, the consequences, they weren't some far-off possibility. And they didn't take days to unfold. They were immediate. Within just 30 minutes of the speech ending, the first major piece of diplomatic fallout landed.
And boom, there it was. The European Parliament's Trade Committee confirmed it. The huge EU-US trade deal was officially suspended. This wasn't just angry words. The threatening language had an immediate, a tangible, and a very costly economic price. Europe was basically saying, we're walking away from the table.
Okay, so after that initial shock and the immediate economic hit, the White House started to offer up a more traditional reason. This wasn't a hostile takeover, they argued. No, this was a necessary move on the global chessboard.
So the argument was pretty straightforward. The Arctic is the new frontier for big power competition. The US needed a stronger presence in Greenland to watch and push back against the ambitions of Russia and especially China in this incredibly strategic part of the world.
But here's the thing about that justification. The picture the Americans were painting was one of this urgent, imminent threat. But the Danes, the people who are actually in charge of Greenland, they were telling a very, very different story.
And this is where things get really interesting. Instead of just playing the victim of a superpower's pressure campaign, Denmark came back with this surprisingly smart and practical response. They didn't just say no, they cleverly took apart the whole argument and offered up a really creative alternative.
The difference was just stark. While the US was sounding the alarm about a major Chinese threat, Danish MP Rasmus Jarlov just laid out the simple reality. China has almost zero presence there. No consulate, no mining, not a single warship anywhere near there in a decade. His little punchline about how it's hard to even find a Chinese restaurant, it just perfectly undercut the whole supposed urgency of the American position.
So after basically debunking the justification, the Danes made a really savvy move. They acknowledged the American security concerns, whether they were real or overblown, and they offered a solution that didn't involve selling off their own territory.
This quote just perfectly captures the witty, disarming, and incredibly practical vibe of their counteroffer. It was a diplomatic way of saying, look, you want a bigger presence, we can help with that. You don't need to buy the whole country to get it.
So Denmark essentially called their bluff. The message was crystal clear. The island is not for sale, period. But if your goal is really about security, then yeah, let's talk. They offered up old American bases, literal ghost towns, to be reactivated. They opened the door for investment. They masterfully turned a threat into a conversation.
But the damage wasn't just limited to U.S.-Danish relations. The ripple effect from this aggressive, transactional approach to diplomacy started to spread, putting pressure on some of America's oldest and most important allies.
And these tactics, they weren't a one-time thing. The United Kingdom, America's closest partner in NATO, suddenly found itself stuck in a very similar geopolitical squeeze play, and it was directly tied to the standoff over Greenland.
And here you have it, from the British Prime Minister himself. He's being explicit. The White House was using a completely separate issue as leverage. This shows a clear pattern of applying pressure on one thing to get a win on another, and that's a tactic that just erodes the trust that holds an alliance like NATO together.
And this, right here, was the ultimate economic risk. The former Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, warned that this kind of high-stakes game could trigger the absolute worst-case scenario, a full-blown tariff war between the United States and a united Europe. So in the end, when you look at the expert analysis, a clear pattern emerges. The disruption is a tool, right? It's meant to grab attention and force a negotiation. But there's a line. According to Panetta, when these tactics start to risk a really costly trade war or become a political problem back home, that's when a retreat is likely. The real danger isn't in any one deal, but in the slow, steady damage to alliances that took decades to build.
And that leaves us with this final, really critical question. The Greenland Gambit might have failed, but it absolutely succeeded in exposing a deep philosophical divide in how nations deal with each other. So in our world today, what actually happens when trust and history and shared values are all treated like they're just numbers on a balance sheet? What is the true cost of a purely transactional world?